are just tuning in, you missed some fun repartee going on offline between sessions, and a lot of people looking forward to gathering again next year. It sounds like mostly post sessions over beers and prime rib, but I guess we'll have to do that virtually this year. My name is Sydney Ganan. I'm with the Jocelyn Castle in Omaha, and I'm excited for this next session on exhibit design. I think we've all had some point in the last year and a half where we've asked ourselves, oh my goodness, what do we do now? The people to answer that question are folks like the Traubs, who have decades of experience helping small and medium-sized museums go through a visioning process to design exhibits. So today, I understand we're going to learn a little bit about, what when the public is looking to us to share with them what it was like during the pandemic, will we be ready? So without further ado, I hand it over to the Traubs.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sydney, for that good introduction, and thank you for the invitation to make a presentation to you today. We've been on the conference with you all for yesterday and today, and we've really enjoyed it. And I have to admit that it's kind of nice to go to a conference and still be in my fuzzy slippers. So without further ado, Don's going to step away so that I can get closer to my screen, and then he will be back to do the latter half of the program. Our session is called Celebrations and Memorials, Museums in the Time of COVID. And I have to admit, I am not much of a picture person, so you're just going to have to listen to me for a while. But I assure you that Don is going to make up for all the lost pictures that you've missed in his part of the presentation.
Just click that button.
Click the button.
Then click the mouse.
Okay, here we go. As you well know, we have been in a pandemic for the last 12 months. It is ongoing. We're not out of it yet, and it is a significant event. The other museums are keepers of communities' history and their significant treasures, and what, as museums, should we be doing during this pandemic. Let's look at three museums that might have addressed the same thing and looked at the same thing. One of them, for any of you who have been in Kansas City and have been to the World War I Museum. It's a very interesting museum. It's 80,000 square feet. So there's lots to see. If you've been here once, you deserve to come back several times. We managed to get there 2-3 times a year. In 1919, immediately following the First World War, some folks in Kansas City formed an association called the Liberty Memorial Association. They raised, get this, $2.5 million in 10 days, and selected and dedicated a site 2 years later, and opened an impressive monument and began collecting. The monument was always referred to as the Liberty Memorial. It had continued to be referred to as the Liberty Memorial even until 1994, when it was closed down because it was deemed unsafe and it was deteriorating. Again, in 1994, a group of folks in Kansas City started raising money for the repair and of the memorial, and thought at that time that they should put a museum under the memorial. They had been collecting since the time of their formation in 1919. They had been collecting documents and artifacts and big guns and films and photographs. And so after 90 years of collecting materials, they opened in 2006 with what you have seen or should see. It took 90 years for them to tell that story. The World War II Museum took approximately 60 years for the time after the Second World War to be able to tell their story, interpret their story, and look at the significant impact that the war had on our communities and our world. I don't know about any of you. I think some of you were children of World War II vets. And you know as well as I do that we never asked about it. We were never told any details about, gee, Daddy, what did you do in the war? It was a time when it was a forbidden topic. My father came back from the European theater in Italy. My uncle, who was in the Philippines when the war broke out, came back after 5 years of being a POW of the Japanese, and he was liberated out of slavery in Manchuria at the end of the war. And when the two of them came back, they never discussed it with their families, and they never discussed it with each other. It was one of those, well, you're home now, everything's back to normal. It took a long time. It took 60 years before a World War II museum was opened, and it was, I think, in 2000. It is in New Orleans, and though I have not visited it, it is it's beautiful on the website, and I wish I had a picture of it, but I don't. The other large significant space I wanted to visit with you about is the National Vietnam Museum. And if you don't know where it is, it's because it isn't. It isn't yet. There is a small museum dedicated to Vietnam. It's in Texas. As far as we could tell in a search on the web, it's one of the only museums that has been devoted to the Vietnam War. We have a project in 1996, 30 years after the start of the Vietnam War. We started a project called Firebase Eagle. That project was started with a group of veterans from Vietnam, and they were all from Altoona, Pennsylvania, which was a community that was heavily involved in the draft. A significant number of young men were drafted from that community. So it was something that was very real to all of them. Their idea was to create a museum, a national museum. That's what they wanted it to be, a national museum devoted to the infantry there in Vietnam. After many years, actually, by the time we left Pennsylvania in 2005, the project had finally fallen apart. It was a long, slow death, and it was interrupted just about the time that we felt like we were getting someplace with this concept. 9/11 came around, and it just took all of the wind out of the sails that they had, And unfortunately, they never were able to come around. And what happened was the whole project died in development. And I think what, in retrospect, what we had discovered was that it just had not come of time yet. It was just not, the story was not ready to be told yet. It hadn't been digested well. It still hasn't. And it may take another couple generations before the story comes into its own time. There are some things that that were in common of these three museums. All of them started out as memorials. The Liberty Memorial, it was not a museum, it was just a memorial. There were the World War II memorial. Well, there's some of that on the National Mall, but it's a memorial. It's not a museum. And finally, the museum has been opened. And as far as the Vietnam situation, that memorial is still a very, very powerful place to go and to be. And when we first got to visit that, it was shortly after it had opened. And our host, who was a Vietnam veteran, said to us, if you really want to see the power of this place, you should come here at night, because there are vets that sit all around the perimeter and just sit here all night and just watch over this memorial. So it was still a real place of memory for these veterans. They wouldn't come during the day, they were just there at night. So all of those places started as memorials. They were somewhat immediate. They were lasting. They had an emotional impact on the events and the people that were involved in the events from the beginning. The other thing was that the folks that were involved in the preparation and of the memorials themselves really never lost sight of what ultimately their goal was to be, which would be some sort of an explanation of the war or the event that they had come from. It was interesting when I was doing web searches on these three museums. I also looked for any kind of a museum that memorialized or celebrated a disease. And I found none. Surprisingly, I found none. I think there is one that's in Europe, and whether or not it was a museum of typhoid or whether it was a museum of smallpox, I can't remember. That was the only one I found. But the other thing that had that these three war museums had in common was during this period when things were just a memorial, and in looking forward to a museum eventually interpreting and describing the impact of the museums.
Oh, I totally forgot.
And,
How about
okay,
Someone's mic is live. If you could mute yourself, please.
thank you. But anyway, the other thing that they had done, again, not losing sight of their eventual plans to open a museum, they had started collecting things. The World War I Museum is just phenomenal. If you've ever been there, it is jam-packed with all kinds of things like, big guns and old bicycles and just an enormous photo collection that is on display, and collections of old newsreels and so forth. Everything that they had, everything that they show had been in their collection. It's not like they had to go out and find anything. It was there, and they'd been collecting for 90 years. So if we're talking about memorials in the time of COVID, we need to be collecting and gathering things. And I think that, and we need to start really looking at the things that we have collected, because so much of our collection now, so many of the things that are pertinent to telling stories are fleeting. Things that are when we talk to each other, for example, we don't sit down and write letters to each other anymore. We send out a quick text or an email, and then it's gone. When we make presentations like this, in a month, they'll all be up online, but the cloud's not all that reliable, and it will. I have 4 minutes left. Oh, okay. And it will be very fleeting. Don is going to take you through what we consider our museum exhibit development process. We're not going to get into design or any of that. We're going to just talk about development. And the development is going to assess what stories you want to tell in your museum. Now, this could be COVID. This could be a story of something else that's gone on in your history. But the process is the same. We look and ask you for the stories you want to tell in your museum. We ask you then what artifacts you have to support those stories. And then we ask you for whatever documents, photographs, films, ephemera, any of that you have also to support that. So as you're collecting now for even an exhibit, not necessarily a museum, but even an exhibit on your community during the COVID virus, you need to be thinking about, how long can I keep this? This has to be, basically it has to be on paper someplace. If you recall all of the small little museums that popped up during the bicentennial, people were running around talking to everybody that had at least 2 white hairs on their head and saying, please tell us your story. And it was so much easier after that to talk to people and record their conversations, but not transcribe them. And they found that the technology that was available at the time just did not hold up. And so those stories are lost. They're just, the stories that were on tape that were not transcribed are gone. So we don't want that to happen to us with our digital advantages or disadvantages. And so I think that I am going to step away and have Don talk to you about how this process of development works in real life. And then if you're thinking about some sort of an exhibit, something happening in your town, you can kind of deconstruct that and say, what do I have to do now to be ready for this kind of a developmental process in the future? Hold on, we have a staff change. Oh, shoot, I never got this up. Well, okay.
Take your water.
Hmm?
Take your water.
Sorry. Never got my-
Afternoon. So from what Susan told you about this process we use. It's we call it visioning. It gives the client, the board or the exhibit committee, the option to be totally involved in the project. That's both a good point and a bad point, but it gets everybody's voices heard, and that's what it really is important for this whole process to take place, is to have everybody heard, and the operating word is the inclusivity. Looking back at or listening to Steve this morning, the thing that came out most dominant to me was plan, plan, plan. And I know that all museums have been really shuttered by the pandemic, but I know too that all those staff members were still there, most of them, and catching up on a lot of stuff that had been put aside for years and years. Planning is not something that should be ever put aside. And so let me walk you through some of the things that we do as in our planning for new exhibits before we even put any pencil to paper, do any drawings. You're going to ask me, why did we select Fort Morgan? And that happens to be a project we did about 10 years ago in Fort Morgan, Colorado. And one of the reasons why we selected it was it has similar demographics and environment to sites in Nebraska. And the most important item for selecting was that that project was that we were able to use all of the visioning elements that we've been developing over the years and put that into the development activity, all those different elements. We were able to successfully mount this long-term exhibit, long-awaited exhibit for the town of Fort Morgan, and we've had marvelous reactions to it. The word inclusivity is really dominant when planning the visitor's experience. Every visitor should be able to identify with some historic personality or some historic item or photo or label text. Social and racial equality should be obvious to all. Don't be subtle. Visitors don't recognize the subtle approach. So if you're going to be inclusive, you've got to get everybody around the table. And a lot of that has to do with how you develop the exhibit committee, which usually comes from the board members out of the board, and then special interest people, sometimes some funders sometimes come in. People that have a lot of emotional investment in the project will want to be there. But the exhibit committee itself the members of that have to be agreeable to meet throughout the exhibit process, most heavily during the development and the design phase, but they have to be available, and we don't want switching personalities and persons involved in the exhibit committee, because there's no continuum there. People don't hook up to the same ideas and thoughts that have been there all along. One of the things that was dominant in agreement, a strong agreement throughout, and which came up very early in the whole process of visioning, was that the exhibit committee agreed to let personal stories tell the history of Fort Morgan. Now that's a pretty big, tall investment, because so many times the exhibits are the people that write the exhibits are the curators or the historians who really know the information firsthand and back and forth, but they haven't experienced it. And that's a big difference. And so we started the search for looking for personal stories that were able to be illustrative of historical events within the community. We were fortunate, we found a lot of them. There are two goals for that exhibit development stage that we're talking about. And that is to create and approve an exhibit narrative that will be generated by us, Traub Design Associates, after the 2 years of the exhibit development meetings with the exhibit committee. It took that long, about 2 years, to get all this sort of stuff, all these ideas out on the table. And then we had to pull together all these things, find some unifying threads that ran through it, themes, and go from there, trying to piece it out, try to correlate historical events with personal stories, and the national events, the context that needed to be done, to put out an exhibit that just talks primarily about the local event, the local situation, really doesn't help a lot of the people that are members of your audience, visiting audience. People don't know their history. So you have to give them something to hang their hat on, some event, some national or international event. We always try to figure out how to get that information so people can understand how that all worked together. During the exhibit development stage, there's also a search for all archival and artifact collections. They surveyed them for the primary support materials that would enhance the individual stories. You need to review your own resources, as well as local, state, or county, state, national repositories. It's part of responsibility, your personal responsibility or due diligence to develop that exhibit. Once the gaps in the historical resources from your survey of your collection and identifying what's missing, identified as you can utilize a collection initiative to help fill in the collection gaps. And it is a great opportunity to get yourself in front of your local public. As we all know, people have got stuff stashed everywhere in their houses, especially with this, we're staying with the pandemic idea. There's going to be a lot of masks sitting around. There's going to be a lot of hand sanitizer. But the important part is the stories that go with them. But those artifacts still have to be collected. We also tried to identify during that exhibit development period wow factors that could be incorporated into the exhibit. Now, this exhibit had to incorporate 5,000 square feet of space. That's not a big, comparatively not a large space, big enough for our institutions that we deal with. But we were looking for wow factors that were impressive, that would surprise people, that would present unknown or unexpected events or artifacts that will grab the visitor's attention and heighten their interest in the subject matter, whatever that subject matter is. And in our case, and for Morgan, it was the history of the town. Excuse me. Pictures are coming, folks. But there was also in-house development of an exhibit notebook that was necessary in order to produce any more information or design details. And that information, or that exhibit notebook, included all the historical resources, the artifacts, the archival materials, images, label text, conservation issues, and exhibition instructions for the artifacts that are included in the book. The exhibit notebook actually begins being developed in this exhibit development stage right away. and ends in the final stages of the design phase, just prior to fabrication. Reality is that's the way we'd like it, but there's always artifacts that come in all the time. They're included, they're pulled, it just gets kind of crazy until that book gets settled. And that happens at the end of the design period. We developed an approved exhibit narrative. After all this discussion, this 2 years of discussion, looking at some of the key artifacts that we had to work with at the time, we developed a figurative exhibit narrative with some illustrations to show what we thought this exhibit would look like. We were guided by the exhibit narrative and the incomplete notebook, exhibit notebook. But we had identified themes, and we had identified personalities, various activities, historical events, and we had to distribute them within the 5,000 square feet of the gallery space. We used personal stories that throughout the space. We highlighted them in label text and in flip book pages, and they gave us some great ideas to work with. And one of the design ideas that we came up with, because we wanted to be inclusive, we wanted to have everybody included, we developed something called a children's track. Excuse me. In response to the local audience survey information that said that there were a lot of kids coming through during the day, but going with their caregiver, their parents or grandparents or whatever. The kids never had anything to do. They'd go in, run around, as a parent, you can only take so much of that before you leave. And so they also had kids' corners where toys and things were located throughout the exhibits, a couple places, so that there was something for children to do. But the biggest complaint that we had about the exhibit design was that they were complaining about having to clean off the nose prints and fingerprints of all the glass work on the children's track. And we'll be able to see that in just a minute. Yeah, let's go through some. This happened to be a poem that Susan found, which she forgot to put in to show you when she was here. But it's a poem that was written right after in 1869, and were again reprinted in 1919. And if you get a chance to take a look at it, that'd be great, because it's the same experiences that we've had. Here's some pictures of the Fort Morgan Museum before we got involved with it, before we changed the design. And most of them, you see probably a lot of close examples to some of your museums, or what your museum used to look like. Excuse me, I think pollen allergies have got me. This is one item, this museum cauldron that you see here, and it's big. It's 3 feet across, or 40 inches across, and weighed probably close to 250, 300 pounds. And it was one of the items that the museum wanted to put in their exhibit. Why? Because it was too big to move anywhere else. So we had to find a place and a method of using it. Doesn't look too impressive right now. The stories that we use to illustrate the history of Fort Morgan came from people like this. This is the entrance panel to that exhibit. And all these are historical characters that their families loaned us personal, family heirloom photographs of characters within their family that would help us illustrate the historical story of Fort Morgan. And all these people are real, were real. And they are seen throughout the exhibit. This is just the group of them meeting you to begin escorting you through the exhibit. This is one of the first diagrams that we made of that exhibit gallery, 5,000 square feet. And we had various themes located. We had timelines associated. We had activity areas. These were all done during the development of that exhibit narrative that we had. From the narrative, we went to preliminary design drawings. This is the Native American section, very early. We had to do a lot of original art for the timeline and scattered it throughout the, along with all your stewards of the past that were scattered throughout the exhibit. Another showing more of the elements, the timeline that had to be developed, all the original artwork, the structures, the semaphore, some of the larger artifacts that were involved. Here's the floor plan that was created. Remember, we were talking about wow factors. One of our first ones is the Cheyenne teepee, and there's something over here we'll show you in a minute. You see this large, not large, it's a small U.S. Army aircraft trainer. Fort Morgan during World War II was a training base for glider pilots. And you have to learn to fly first before you can learn how to use a glider. Another angle of those galleries. Like I said, we had to do a lot of original artwork. We're fortunately blessed with a good illustrator that I've worked with for 30 years and got a lot of information just pictorially. We couldn't find good photographs to work with in most cases to tell the story, so we used original art to do the work. This is an original pencil sketch of the troopers at the fort playing baseball. Remember I said that one of the things is something that's unexpected or unknown, and this was it. I mean, baseball, you wouldn't expect the Army soldiers out on the frontier doing baseball, but they were, but that's what they were enjoying at the time.
7th Cavalry played ball before they went to.
Here's the final part of the final composition, Troopers ball game. We took this from the pencil sketches up to the final work. We had the artist work in scale so that when we could scan the images, we could blow them up large enough to make billboards out of them. So you'll see that in a couple of places. Remember, we talked about inclusivity and strange stories. We found a story about a woman bullwhacker, illustrated her in one of our drawings. This is that Cheyenne teepee that we set in, 14-foot diameter. We had a mannequin inside, Cheyenne girl preparing pemmican. But all the artifacts, everything in there is reproductions. We couldn't risk the chance of putting out original artifacts. Remember I was talking about the trooper ball game? Well, there's the image, but you remember the cauldron, excuse me, not a colander, the cauldron, that large, heavy 40-inch diameter kettle, was actually used by the Army as a laundry kettle. They'd boil all their stuff up in the kettle, and this woman here was, according to our story, the wife of this sergeant here, and she was watching the ball game while she did her laundry. Remember I told you about there was a little boy in the front, in the stewards, there was this boy holding the rabbit. There was another man dressed in Western garb, holding up his hat, waving. Here is the children's track for that space. And we put a lot of children's toys in there. And they're always got fingerprints all and nose prints all over it, so kids are looking at it. Remember we told you about the personal stories? They were captioned in flip books, additional barbed wire samples. Everybody's got them. Were stored in study drawers underneath. Again, original art for that particular exhibit.
Custom built cabinetry.
Here's another section on the arrival of the train and the importance of the train in the history of Fort Morgan. One of the walkways going between sections. This, the beet harvest has an interesting story along with it. What goes with it, remember I told you that we used images of photographs of people that were actually there at Fort Morgan in these events. Well, a woman showed up after we had installed this section of the exhibit, and she just stood there in front of it. We had two little children in original art form standing in front of this, kind of watching it. So they were standalone, but this woman was one of those little girls that we portrayed. And she was crying away. It was like, she said, I never thought I'd ever see me or my family portrayed in an exhibit. So, you know, that's sort of what it's all about. Different categories. We used a local bridge as an icon to cross over from basically the end of the 20th century, 19th century to the 20th century. Here's another wow factor. This was a full-size windmill that we installed. This is the second gallery that's there. We also had to do the commerce. Again, it was, you know, here's individual, here's the story. It's just let the people tell their own story is the easiest way of doing it. Cuts down on your label writing, if nothing else. Fourth wow factor was a soda fountain presentation where this boy, there was this soda jerk actually spoke to you. And again, it was a case of having to work with an object, a museum object that was so big you couldn't store it and you couldn't move it. So that's why we had to develop this particular element. Another wow factor was the fact that this was a training site during World War II for glider pilots. We actually located a plane similar to one that they used. We located it in Texas, restored it, repainted it, brought it out, and hung it in that gallery. This was a original art piece, but it was a composite of about 4 different photographs of the Army, Air Force training site, landing strip, and the planes all lined up, fueling, and men discussing the flight and stuff like that. So we also, here's the way that large Stinson plane looked like after it's finally installed. So again, the word is plan, plan, plan. You've got your time, you've got some time to do that. You should take the time. You should get everybody involved. And it's an incredibly energizing, frustrating, but rewarding experience to mount a good exhibit. And I think that's it for now. Yeah. thank you again. Thank you very much for allowing us to present to you today, and we'll open up for questions, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting, and what a cool exhibit. What a beautiful project you put together there. As a reminder, we just ask that folks submit their questions into the chat, and I'll facilitate that. As I was looking through it, one of the things that I noticed is you did a lot of work in pulling information and items to exhibit or to celebrate in the exhibit. Were there, as you were collecting those materials, were there items that were deemed inappropriate or unusable, and was that a controversy that you had to deal with?
Not on this project, but we have had stuff that, artifacts that can't go out usually for conservation purposes. We do not use any original documents, photographs. The only thing that's usually original are the artifacts, unless you can find good reproductions. But the others, through computers and digitizing, you can get your documents, historical documents, to look exactly like the original. And that's the safest for them. I mean, if you want your artifacts and your historical documents to exist in 150 years, lock them up, don't let any light on them, keep them in a dry place, and you'll be fine. But that doesn't help your audience, your visitors, your taxpayers see what you have collected. So that's why digital stuff works really well.
I don't know if I conveyed this well. One of the things that we sometimes struggle with is that people want to make donations to us, which are maybe close to appropriate, but not exactly appropriate. And so navigating that that difficulty of the rejection of, well, you're not going to be part of what you didn't contribute to what we're offering in the story that we're telling.
Yeah, that's always a problem. Sometimes you get lucky and they kind of open up a new avenue for you that you didn't know about. We've had that happen before. But yeah, you always have to kind of walk a line when you have that opportunity. I'm not in collections anymore, so but I do know that, that problem it does exist frequently, and that's really collection policy. A good solid collection policy will help you in that situation.
Well, again, we'll open it to the group. What other questions do we have for the Traubs?
What did you put up the poem just because I completely forgot that I actually had a slide. I'm going to put it up and let you. I don't know. Can you make it large enough for them to read it? Oh, don't go away. Oh, there you go. This will just be eye candy while we have a conversation, and if people want to read it, that's fine too. Are there other questions?
We've got a comment from Steve. I think it was very insightful to suggest collecting the objects from the pandemic as experienced in our communities. As it becomes history, we hope, it's our job to collect it. And I think you talked a little bit, what about guidance, guiding, well, you did talk about what guides that human experience locally. So I appreciate that.
Well, I think the closer you can get to the more individual experience on a local level, by people that live around you, used to live here, whatever your identity is with the story that's being presented, will help you as a visitor understand better the topic that you're basically immersed in right now.
I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day who said that her one of her aunts, probably in her 80s, started the day that her community shut down for the pandemic, and she started writing a journal. And exactly 1 year later, she closed it up and said, and put it in her lockbox and said, maybe someday somebody might be interested in what I've written. Holy cow. I'm going to guess that there are a lot of people that have journaled during this period. And whether or not you can get those journals, it's probably way too early to ask for them, but to at least maybe make an inventory or keep a list of known journals that are out there, because that's going to be your narrative if you want to do something about this particular time. And even if not, looking back in another 30 or 40 years or whatever, it'll be a really interesting narrative about what people did during this time. Hence my piece there, which I think is really interesting. It
And
just takes time to get some perspective.
yeah, we got that comment in the chat from Audrey, how apropos it is. Here we're looking back all these years later, and the sentiment is right on point.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Human experiences don't change that much.
Other questions that for the Traubs before we let them go for this moment? Awaiting the prime rib afterward.
That's next year.
Okay, well, with that, I would like to extend thanks on all of our behalfs for an interesting and informative session, and we look forward to seeing your next work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.